Good morning. I'm Mark Harris. I'm one of the artists here at the studios on Walnut Street. And there are three of us who are printmakers. And I'm one of those. And I work primarily in woodcuts and linocuts. And I want to show you a little bit of the work that we're doing here. But I wanted to start by a reminder. You all know this, I'm sure, but this is where printing comes from. In a cave in France, there is that. Well, I didn't get the thumb, but you got the idea. There it is, all the rest of it. Maybe I'll do that again with the thumb. That is a case of printing. This is called the matrix. It's the thing on which you put the ink. And this instead of paper. And I have to get the ink off. A constant in printmaker's problem is that ink is dirty and filthy and gets on your hands and gets on the paper, gets into everything. One of the other early printmaking skills was essentially stenciling. And what would happen is the person would put their hand up against the wall and then have some powder in there and blow it, and it would make then a stencil outline. A variation on that is essentially this, where you make a stencil, and everybody knows about stencils. So most of what we're doing here is an extension of that. This isn't a very good stencil, but it gives you an idea. Again, very primitive processes used over and over again. In the early 1400s, paper was introduced as a medium, as the matrix on which you printed, and movable type was invented, and suddenly printmaking became an industrial appendage. You printed things for mass use. There's some question as to whether or not what you printed was actually art, or whether it was something you sold so that you could actually do your other work, which was art. But printmaking then developed, and with it developed machines for printing. And so the modern printmaker tends to have machines, and I've got one of the big ones. This machine here is what is called a Washington pull press, iron press, and the object of this whole system is to move that plate about 2 millimeters. So it presses down just a little bit. I'll show you how that works in just a few moments. But this was a development that grew out of the Gutenberg press. This set of levers replaced the kind of a turn screw that Gutenberg used. And so it's much easier to use than that would have been. That was a very labor-intensive activity. But here, the matrix consists of type that is set, individual pieces of type, and they're put in what's called a chase, which holds the type in place. And one takes that type and one remembers, you ink up the type. And don't follow me around, just watch that for a second while I get a piece of paper. And you put a piece of paper on that. And then you put a blanket on top of that. The blanket will give a little bit of play so that the slight variations in the height of the type will be accounted for and allowed for, and everything will hopefully get covered with ink. So now I crank this whole bed under the plate. Now, with a little luck, I've done it right. At least I find that there's an amazing amount of luck involved, at least on the first run. One of the nice things about setting type and working with it is that you proof it for a few times to make sure that you've got it right, and then you can produce 1,000 copies if you want, and they'll all look exactly alike. But the first ones are always a bit of a problem. Well, see, there I didn't quite ink it quite right because the D and the N are not as inked as the rest is. But that's a piece of printmaking of type. And the type, if you look carefully at the paper exactly, I could make it lighter. I wouldn't have to press it quite as hard, but you would get then all of the letters as clear as those are. So that's an example of that kind of work. But the work that I mostly do, I don't work mostly with type. I use type in some of the prints that I do because I value very much one of the reasons why printmaking grew with the industrial work of actually setting type. Setting type turned out to be a fairly revolutionary activity. What it meant was that anybody could have pieces of written material. When we talk about the freedom of the press, we're mostly talking about the freedom to set type, produce things, and then get them out to thousands of people all at once. So I tend to use type in my work as a way of augmenting the images for essentially social purposes. That is to say, I'm trying to say something, and the type then augments the image that I use. So here I've got set up, hopefully, an image that I carved. The carving is done on a variety of matrices that all actually a form of synthetic material that acts a lot like linoleum does, but is a little more forgiving in terms of carving. Now I've already inked this mostly, and I'm just sort of putting a little edge to that. And lay down the piece of paper. But I know with some luck, I know that this is actually about that thickness. And I can just, hopefully with a little luck, print it without having to use a blanket. Now that feels a little bit as if I need to put an additional piece of paper in there. This all just sort of helps to make it press a little. Yeah, that's got a little more. Okay, and to make sure that I got the whole thing, I'm going to bring it out. Press that a little further. There we go. Now, with luck, I've had enough pressure, and we'll get a decent print out of that. If not, that's okay. Come back and do it again sometime. but you get the idea how this works. Yeah, that's pretty good. Now there's a fleck in there, you see right there? Well, I'll have to, you can actually cheat a little bit on that. I can just smoosh a little ink over that and that'll cover that. But otherwise, that's a pretty decent print. But, you know, loaves of bread, right? So, a lot of the prints that I do are essentially variations on this kind of thing. Sometimes I augment using the matrix of a linocut or a linoleum cut with some other things like rolling the ink just on the paper directly with the roller and doing sort of background patterns of one sort or another. And so you end up getting a variety of effects. This, for example, is a combination of a wood block, and the background was done by, actually I put grass on the paper and then sprayed over the top of it. And then these are stencils, and this is another wood block. This is straight linocut. That's a single print. This is a combination of a linocut and print type set there. Resist, the other being the fist, and the third one being the Dharma wheel, the Buddhist Dharma wheel. And there's another version of that where I put the wheel inside the hand. So you see a variety of those kinds of effects. The other kind of work that I do are etchings, and these are examples of those. This was actually more abstract than the other. But I wanted to show you how that works. I've got set up here a small etching press. Let's see how maybe I need to wet this slightly again. No, this is probably okay. No, it needs to be wet slightly more. Etching presses predate, I believe, the letter presses, and they were ways of mass producing material, and were first used for doing things like printing official documents or money, but also for printing playing cards. And playing cards were a sort of a major moneymaker for early printmakers. But etchings were a way of producing finer prints in numbers where you could actually sell some, it's not a single item, so you could sell copies of it. And so now what I've done is I put the wet paper on top of the plate, which has already been inked, and then it has several blankets, and I've got a piece of cheater paper in there to thicken it up just a little bit. And for me, etching is probably the most chancy activity of all, frankly, in that I'm still at the front edge of learning how to do it right. So for me, the major issue about etching turns out not to be the etching process itself, but the inking and making sure that I've done the inking the right way. The answer usually is I've not done the inking the right way, so we'll see what happens today. This is quite heavy pressure, and actually it's kind of hard to turn it. There we go, it's gone now beyond the edge of the plate. Oh, there, a little bit more. Perfect, except, well, no, a little piece of it got, the ink had sat there too long, and so a little piece of it got torn off. But there's an example of doing an etching. I just wanted to show you one other thing that sort of is an interesting way of using printmaking. You can sometimes take ordinary items that are part of the printmaking world already. For example, here's a piece from the New York Times about war diaries. And the war diaries are a way of remembering those who have served in war and those who have suffered with war, and to bring them into the moment. So there's the written word remembering those war diaries, and it's actually a very good article. But if you want, you can decide that over the top of that, you want to make another kind of statement entirely. Actually, I've got to put this under that, sorry. So here's War Diaries Finally Speak. And what you do is you do across this. Hold on, I gotta find the... Okay, I'll just do it without it. We'll see whether I can press it with my hand well enough.
What was it that you're looking for?
Oh, there's a briar to rub it with, but here we go. Oh, this will work. Well, it'd been nice if I'd put it the right way. We'll try it again. We'll do it. But you got the idea. So I had this piece that I carved with the word presente, which is obviously the word in Spanish for present. And what it was this way of signaling that we are bringing the people who we're remembering present to us. Okay, this time I'll get it right. So you can use printmaking also as a way of taking what's in the news or taking what's otherwise printed and then making statements about what is printed. So in this case, we write presente. This opens up all sorts of possibilities for combining various forms of printmaking all into one combination piece. And I'm working on one right now, only it's just beginning. The New York Times on Sunday published 1,000 of the names of those who, I think you can see it, 1,000 of the names of people who have died of the virus. And I'm using that as a background over which I'm going to be putting an image that I had already, and then some larger type as well. And so what happens is that becomes an art statement built out of pieces of printing, commercial printing, and and pieces of art that I had. The piece of art that I'm working with is actually the piece is right under here. Obviously it's not done yet, but not inked yet. But it's Rachel weeping for her children. So that's the kind of thing that I'm involved in. I produce a lot of crappy paper when it's all over with. Stuff that I can't use, but I end up using that for other purposes, and sometimes those things get incorporated in new pieces that I build out of the old ones. So there you are. That's the work I do.
Do you want to describe some of these pieces on the wall?
Sure. These are examples of very different sorts of working. This is done a combination of roll. You can see that I've rolled ink in the background on top of a carefully rolled out yellow. Then I rolled some darker colors. And then this is spilled India ink that I then forced or jiggled and kind of forced it. Effect, which I rather like, is a little bit like cave painting. You get this sort of sense that there's activity going on there, and there may have been multiple, multiple designers of that. That again is what's happened in this one. This is a piece done entirely by using rollers of ink. This piece is a combination of using rollers. These are single width rollers, right? But behind here, sometimes if you have a roller on which you've got ink that's kind of spotty, it sort of shows up as a repeated pattern, boom, 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 across here. Those are done, these little dots are all done by putting ink on the dots, the bubble dots for packaging, and then pressing that against the board. And this, of course, then is a print. Actually, it's this block right here, which was done on wood. It's a wood block. And I printed that on paper and then glued that on top of the whole piece. So that's got a whole variety of different techniques. The vertical lines here are done by taking corrugated, this is a screen overlay, those ridges. This is a piece of cloth that I put ink on and pressed it in and then lifted the cloth off. There's another kind of example of using bubble wrap. And then the other piece of technique on there is it's a kind of offset lithography. You ink a plate, you put this down on the plate, and you draw on the back side. So the drawing is actually on the back side of this, and the ink shows through. What are other examples of kinds of? That is a combination of both printmaking and then using the prints in a collage form on a background that was a combination of inked and free-floating inks that are then rolled a bit in addition. And then I used a little bit of typeset for the title, which is Love and Resistance. So there's a variety of techniques. This last one right here, the bright yellow one, is actually a silk screen. And that's done in 3 parts. There's the... Oh, I seem to be having trouble connecting.
Well, when we get close to metal.
Oh, I see what you is.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there you are.
And also, do you want to tell us about your sculpture?
Oh,
Well,
one of the things is I said earlier, you end up producing a lot of waste as you go along, and so I had some various pieces that were not finally going to be used for anything else, and I set them together on foam board, and it turns out they make kind of an interesting sculpture. What else? There's another example of using just waste pieces. I made those cubes. And one of the entirely useless but kind of fun things that I did was I made this, which is made out of a variety of pieces. This is from a larger piece that I decided not to use for anything else, so I used that for the base, and then for the column. And for the base, I just had a variety of pieces that I glued on a large foam board. And then this was all done using tracing paper that I had inked over the course of time. When you ink up a roller, one of the ways to clean it is to roll the ink off onto something else. And so I used the pieces of paper. The only thing this is good for is I've got a hat, which I can then keep.
It has this purpose.
At least a purpose. The other machine that I have here, actually I've got two other machines. This is a hydraulic press. It's a homemade press, and it will take really large sheets. So you can run, you ink this up, put the paper on it, run this under, and then you crank this down like this. And then when it gets to there it runs, you crank it down as hard as you need to, and that rises back up. And then when you pull this out, if you're lucky, you end up with this whole thing printed. This kind of press is used by Marianne Ellen Daly, who's next door. She has a much fancier version, but it makes it possible for her to produce monoprints with great accuracy, and they work really well. So I think that's it. Have we done?
All right.
I think we've done it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. I'm glad that you were here.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Right.